Hi, everyone. I wanted to welcome everyone to the fourth in our series of the future of U.S. foreign aid. Um, um, Let me just start by introducing CID. I am the faculty director of the Harvard Center for International Development. We are a Harvard University-wide center which focuses on both research and practice in the field of international development. The series we've started is really focusing on some of the big changes happening in the last several weeks, but not just in the last several weeks. These changes in many ways have been in the making for the past several months, if not years. Um, and so it'd be great to kind of hear from a series of our experts on what these changes mean, both for the world and for those of us who are in the practice of development. The last three sessions we've had have examined foreign aid's role in diplomacy, its effectiveness, and its impact on the humanitarian responses. Today's event is development economics in a changing world. The context is very much what you're seeing with the USAID's fairly drastic cuts in development funding. We're seeing the termination of about 83% of USAID programs and about 92% of foreign assistance-related grants. These aren't just numbers, they actually mean millions of people are losing access to education, to healthcare, to economic opportunities. And they really threaten decades of progress that we have made in development. Moreover, the USAID events are, while the motivation may be different, they're causing kind of ripple effects as well. As you may know, FCDO and other agencies have been cutting development funding as well. So this is really a sobering moment for development. But we're hoping that this is also a moment we can rethink of how our field can meet these challenges. We are incredibly lucky to have my dear friend Dean, someone I've known for the last 30 years or so. And Dean and I have seen
Oh, man.
a whole ups and downs in the field of development. This may be a particularly downing moment. Um, Dean is just a spectacular individual. I knew him since we were graduate students together. And Dean, to me, is one of the most entrepreneurial people in the field of development. He's a phenomenal academic. Several of you may have been familiar with some of his seminal work. Um, he's also a real entrepreneur. He founded Innovations in Poverty Action, which is one of the most impressive evidence meets development organizations in the world. And most recently, Dean was the first ever chief economist of USAID. Hopefully, I don't know if you'll be the first and last, or is it the first, Dean, or?
First, slightly wordier statement to just to correct, because there have been some stellar people before as chief economist. So it was the first chief economist of an office of the chief economist,
Oh,
which bureaucratically is meaningful. We can talk about it.
makes sense.
History now,
But
but regardless, there's an office, and that was the big change that was made 2.5 years ago.
makes sense. So I wanted to jump straight into our conversation. And the way we're going to have the conversation is we're going to talk for about 40 minutes between us, and then we're going to open up for a Q&A in the last 20 minutes as well. And already in the chat, you should have seen kind of places where you can post questions. So I encourage you to start posting your questions as the conversation continues. Let me start just with maybe some basics on AID. So Dean, if you could just walk us through to say, what is the role of USAID? There's a lot of talk about it, but I'd love to hear from you.
So, um, two answers to that. One is a more theoretical answer, a historical answer, as well as current events answer, and then second, a little bit mechanical. There's a quote from John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy created USAID. He created it with an executive order, but then it was further established and authorized by Congress with various acts that to put it more in place. So, which is part of the legal questions now, because those subsequent acts did actually are law. So it's not as simple as saying created by executive order, eliminate by executive order when you have these intermediary acts which solidified it. But the quote from John F. Kennedy is really striking to me in what he wrote to motivate the creation of USAID. And the reason it's really striking to me is that similarity to Rubio's statements. And so Rubio's statements, which I think many people have heard recently, is that foreign aid should make America safer, stronger, more prosperous, as a kind of, and that's his definition of kind of aligned with U.S. foreign policy. I want to talk more about that definition in a second. But here's a quote from John F. Kennedy from his actual, I don't know if it was a speech or just the written submission to the creation of USAID. And basically said foreign aid is important for US interests under the premise that the economic collapse of low and middle income countries would be, quote, disastrous to our national security, hence safer, harmful to our comparative prosperity, hence more prosperous, and offensive to our conscience, which I would refer to as stronger. And so that parallel is actually really striking in that that was the original goals of USAID, and that's also what Rubio, kind of asserted today as the litmus test. The real challenge is how you define those terms, and I would suggest that actually what we did not see a deviation from those central purposes. What we saw was perhaps a morphing of how we define those terms and what constitutes those things. But that's a much more wonkier conversation. It's really not one based on first principles. And a lot goes into the offensive to our conscience. What does that bring to bear? What does that really mean? In my view of the world, and this is the same, what I would say is the phrase, make America stronger. My view of the world is that doing good, doing the right thing, caring about others, that makes us stronger as a nation. We are a philanthropic nation. We often give voluntarily to many crises, both domestically and abroad. That makes us stronger when we come together for a common ailment to reduce human suffering, and that makes us stronger. But the minute you do that, you can see how that does create a problem where that then does not become as defining a term for, okay, what actually should we be doing and what should we not be doing? And that's where you saw basically two trends happen at USAID. One is a sentiment of we must be everywhere. We must enter into all countries where we can. We must address all humanitarian crises that we can, and even work in all sectors. The second thing that happened just mechanically is a combination of additional layers and layers and layers of oversight that actually, as one can imagine with any government process, bureaucracy, it kind of starts slowing down the process, making it very difficult to make any sort of change. And the second is a decentralization of decision-making, where most of the actual decisions for how to dole out money was made by Congress in terms of the sector and the geography, and then by teams in the countries on how to actually spend the money subject to the constraints from Congress. There was actually strikingly little flexibility at headquarters for what to do. I can vouch for that on a personal level. When we got in and created the office and worked with the front office, the administrator and the deputy administrator, and there were things that they were passionate about, and there was no ability to just kind of move money around across sectors. It was really striking how little flexibility there was because of the constraints from Congress and the decision-making process of putting the power of the pen in terms of procurement into the hands of the people in the missions. And so that led to this kind of centralized decision-making from Congress, but then decentralized decision-making in terms of what actually goes into procurement.
So Dean, just in light of what you just said, I'm curious, as this money is basically gone, how are these impacts going to play out on the recipient communities, on individuals working both in AID, but also downstream effects on individuals who are working in organizations which were really carrying the kind of localization, if you will, agenda? So walk us through. I'm just trying to understand the impact that we should expect to see in the immediate weeks, and then also in the coming months and years.
So, my main answer to some extent is I don't know, because we don't know yet what's going to come in place. There's indications. In fact, there was a memo yesterday that has been floating around that does give more indications and more insights into what the plans are than I had seen before. So let me divide it into short run, long run, but then we'll just point out the obvious that we don't really know what is going to happen. Short run, I think, has been, there's been a lot of press, a lot of attention. There are people whose medicines were cut off. There's people who have been clearly documented have died because of antiretrovirals being cut off for infants. And that is, we've already seen that happen. That's going to happen in the hundreds of thousands in terms of people who will have HIV that would not have otherwise had HIV because of the cutoff. That's just one issue, one disease. It's one disease that was PEPFAR was started by George W. Bush. It was one of the pillars of USAID, and a lot of the work done and a lot of the success done. So that has historically had strong bipartisan support, as I said, started by George W. Bush. But and there's countless other areas to it that have that same kind of short run tragedy that can be attached to just the process in which this was done. Right, you could have canceled things in a way that protected those types of interventions. But so that's short run. Long run, obviously we don't know yet how things are going to be replaced. One of the things that's clear is there's a canceling of awards, but there's a second issue that is, going to play its way out, which is, are they going to respend that money on other things, or are they going to attempt to impound it and take that basically to the Supreme Court, or try to get Congress to agree to let them spend less? So that's an open question. I'm not a constitutional law expert, so let's not go down that path. I don't, my opinion is meaningless in terms of the legal matters and how they play out. What is clear is, I believe, two things. One is we have just made it more expensive to do whatever we choose to do in the future. So the process of doing this was by destroying everything rather than reforming, by canceling existing awards rather than saying stop new awards. We're going to stop the new flow of money, but we're not going to cancel existing awards. That means future aid, wherever we are, whatever we're doing, whether it's investments through DFC, whether it's compacts through MCC, everything just got more expensive unnecessarily. And that's just, that's just a byproduct of short-sighted thinking in terms of how to go about engaging in that kind of vast reform. And why is it going to be more expensive? Well, put yourself in the shoes of a partner country that we're trying to support. Put yourself in the shoes of someone who gets a procurement for a future award and is thinking about bidding on the solicitation. So now what do you have to do in order to bid on that? Well, you really need to put a buffer in place. You don't know whether you can trust the US government to be there. You want to hire people to move to that country. You need to give them enough of a salary buffer that gives them comfort that they can uplift their family, move to a country, and not have to wonder month by month whether they'll get paid or not for their work. And this is true of the country as well. We want a partnership with government in order to help improve their roads, their healthcare system, their education system. And so we're working directly with a strong government. This is very much in line with the thinking of the new plan that I saw last night. Well, we're going to be competing with China for that. And now put yourself in the shoes of that country, and they're choosing who to take the support from. Should they take the support from the country that hasn't pulled out, or that does seem more risky and may or may not pull out and change their mind about what they're doing midstream and just yank everything away? So, how do you resolve that? You have to build in more money. It makes it literally just more expensive. So there's probably a solution there that is literally just about price, upfront payments, whatever the case may be. But it makes it more expensive. And so that's one clear reality that has happened in the long run.
Dean, I'd like you to, as you're talking about this, you have multiple hats, and I want to bring in some of your other hats. One is as someone who has, through IP and others, really built a local presence. And so when I think of a lot of the organizations who are actually on the ground, kind of last mile delivery and so on and so forth, how affected do you think they will be? How reliant were they on USAID? Will they be able to, this is guesswork, I understand, but I trust your instinct on this. will they be able to kind of pivot to other players and still survive, or are we talking about a mass set of layoffs and so these costs are even higher? You have to rebuild organizations which are just going to collapse. Is that what you're
No,
thinking?
I mean, no, there's there's two things that about this that are striking and just frustrating is not the right word. That's makes it seem like a minor annoyance. One is the um, one is the fact that like no, there's projects, there's implementation, there's research. This is a small piece of a very small piece of the pie, so it's maybe not focused there, but there's implementers that are have had to lay off their staff. That is stopping, and it's not that there's just other donors just coming in. USAID was the largest bilateral in the world, and there's some things probably are being picked up by others, but there's a risk in doing that. That sends a message to the U.S. government that you can pull out and others are just going to, be right there for you. There's a moral hazard problem in that. And, I think it's, one that does need to be addressed, one that I think there are situations where you can, kind of correctly say, no, it's worth it. Let's do this. Let's support this. But that process for deciding who and which to fill in the holes on, that's a very difficult value-ridden process, a lot of ambiguity. So there are some players doing that I've heard about, talked with, but it is the resources that are willing and able to do that do not add up to the sum total that was taken away. The second thing that is striking is, USAID has in both Republican and Democrat administrations strived to engage in more what was referred to as localization. And localization took on two types that had two meanings, and both were encouraged and pushed. The first is a bean counting, more of a bean counting exercise. Who is the first recipient of the funds that are procured? This has nothing to do with who ends up getting the funds, to be clear. You can send the money to give directly if there's a cash transfer program that USAID is supporting, and give directly, on passes. Their administrative costs are, I believe, somewhere in the ballpark of 8%, and 92 cents on the dollar gets into the hands of people. There have been quotes from this particular number that were completely, it was one of these cases of like not doing third grade social science math right, where you have words around numbers and all that got repeated was the number of, 10% of money goes into the hands of people. That is completely a complete misread of the sentence, of the words around the number 10%. The 10% number refers to who is the first recipient of awards. Is it a US-based entity or is it a local entity? So there was a lot of push to change that 10% to basically help build the institutions in local countries so that they were more able to handle the procurement, handle the compliance, handle the oversight, the paperwork, the bureaucracy of dealing with the US government. And there were a lot of organizations that were building that capacity, both small US-based nonprofits, such as Innovations for Poverty Action, but also local organizations overseas. And that, investment that people were making, that is now wasted money and wasted resources. That is really an institutional tragedy. The second goal of that is to shift how the decisions are made about what to do and things of that nature. And that's a different motivation that is in a sense independent of how the money flows. So that's the institutional consequence of this is very real in terms of those investments. We want to do that again in the future if that becomes a pillar of this administration or a future one. And again, and now you're a local organization or just an organization without that capacity, and you're told, hey, do you want to play in this arena? You want to receive money from whatever the new acronym is for US foreign aid. But here's the compliance that you have to invest in order to have the internal capacity to deal with the oversight required. You might think, no, I really don't want to make that investment because I can't trust the to lead to something that's stable. And so why would I do that? That's inefficient for me. And so you never take the money, and then maybe those are, good, or maybe those are the best organizations because they're being so thoughtful, and we never get um, basically use them to help deliver better aid. So that's a longer run kind of tragedy to the way this has been done, rather than, the goal that they wanted to get to could have been achieved in ways that were far, far, far less destructive. And that's the part.
Dean, before we move to I want to start moving us towards kind of what can we do? I mean, this is a tough moment, but for a lot of us, I think this is also a rallying cry to think differently and do differently. Before I go there, just one last in terms of now as a researcher, there's been concern a lot about losing knowledge. There's a lot of kind of inherent knowledge in USAID expertise, its own staff, people who are being laid off, in the local experts who they were partnering with, them being laid off and furloughed as well. But also things like DHS, surveys that were ongoing surveys were critical to our decision making. Just give me a minute sort of sense of where do you think these costs are? Are you really concerned about this lack of knowledge as well, or hopefully this gets somehow addressed?
So, I mean, I think there's kind of three buckets there, and I am concerned about it, but it is one of many tragedies going on, right? So I wouldn't say that I'm singularly focused on it, but it is something I am very focused on, since it's the area that I am most comfortable with in terms of where my work is. So I'm most able to, I feel like, engage in some of those conversations about how to adjudicate, how to decide. So you have three types. You have literally ongoing evaluations, ongoing randomized control trials or other kinds of evaluations. In the case of randomized control trials, for instance, the Development Innovation Ventures is a kind of fairly buried in a good way, I would say, pot of money that was earmarked from Congress, and then also further supported by outside philanthropists, that funded randomized control trials, and then if it was at a certain stage, if it was earlier stage, then more piloting exercises, and if it was a later stage, then supported more of the scaling. But the majority of the money was funding randomized controlled trials to study whether a certain innovation was a good approach to dealing with a particular problem. And research near and dear to you and me for many years. And right now you have a lot of randomized control trials that are best described as half-price knowledge with much lower risk, because all that remains to be done is an end line. The intervention has been done, and now maybe even some measurement, but the future measurement needs to be done, the analysis, etc. And the risky part of a randomized control trial is mostly in the beginning. That it's mostly when I look back on my career in terms of my failed projects, they were all in the beginning. It was the intervention, it was the collaboration on how to do the randomization where something went foul. In theory, if the implementation does what they were supposed to do, doesn't mean they achieve what they're supposed to achieve, but just does what they're supposed to do, then the end line is a success regardless of what you learn. If you learn it didn't work, that's a success from a learning perspective, from a research perspective, from a policy perspective. You need to know what doesn't work just as much as you need to know what does work. So the risk is not about what you find. The risk is just about the kind of the protocols and the process of the intervention. So there's a lot of research like that is ripe for picking from philanthropists to say, hey, I want to learn that, and I can learn it at half price and lower risk. Then there's others that are more infrastructure like projects, like the DHS, I was drawing a blank on what the D stood for a second, Demographic and Health Service, which have been hugely influential for not just research, but policy, for ministries of health using those data to track trends in their country, to understand the trends in neighboring or other countries, to understand how their trends are comparing to other people's trends, and that helps alert them to issues and large changes happening in their society that they need to be ahead of and anticipate. And so those have been incredibly informative for countries as well as individual research papers. And USAID supported the the lion's share, I'm not sure exactly what proportion, but a large majority, I believe something in the order of $30 million a year was going to those. Something that could be wrong, but I think it's roughly in that zone. I don't know where that particular award stands. There's other research like that in agriculture. There was some work that, measurement of about what I'm about to say is always a little bit harder, but there was measurement of the 25, 30 years of agricultural research funded by USAID that added it all up, looked at the change in terms of what it produced in terms of knowledge that got into the hands of farmers, and basically found an 8x multiple of the total cost of all of that effort, both the successes and the failures in terms of finding solutions and finding things that weren't solutions. You take the total cost of that, and then you ask what are the benefits that accrued to farmers that then received that advice, and it was about an 8x multiple, right? That work is obviously now stopped. Div in a similar calculation had a 17-to-1 multiplier. My office in some of the meta-analysis we were doing, and then the working with the procurements was a little bit different in terms of the outputs, but we estimated a 40-to-1 return. And these are all short-run returns, to be clear. The true multiplier there is bigger because of knock-on effects. That's just looking at the immediate benefits that happen from the immediate procurement, the immediate programs. But programs continue that are successful, and you have follow-on awards, and you have other awards that learn from awards, and other bilaterals and other donors that learn from success. And so all those multipliers are actually pretty big underestimates of the actual impacts. And these are all basically, all those efforts are called off.
So let's move a bit to what can we do? Like I said, there is obviously a lot of concern, both amongst those, who are receiving aid and those who are in the practice of development. A lot of our students are even beginning to question what careers they should take. Is development going to survive this? And so I want to kind of try and get a silver lining to this and ask you, what are the silver linings over here? What are we seeing? You've talked a lot about some of the constraints in development, even beginning. It's not that the system was perfect to begin with. In many ways, when you joined USAID, and we've talked a bit about your motivations, it was to bring in both evidence, be more innovative, be in some sense more impactful in what we do, stretch our money longer. And so walk us into the future over here a bit, and out of a bit of the current USAID moment. I don't want to reflect so much on it. We're going to go back into the field of development. The problems are still there. The people who care about development are still there. How do we resource this effort?
So, three broad thoughts. First, just to kind of reinforce what you said, you couldn't, I think it was, I just really want to double down on the comment. Nobody at USAID thought everything was working perfectly. There might have been disagreement about how to reform, how much to reform, but one of the things that was striking upon getting there was how many people greeted us with open arms, eager to collaborate. In fact, we never would have had the successes that we did have, that 40-to-1 kind of multiplier. That was not us working in a silo. That was us working with people who greeted us, said, I want to see these changes happen too. How can I help? Let's jump in. Let's do this together. And the reality is I wouldn't have joined USAID if I thought everything was run perfectly. They wouldn't have asked me to join if I thought everything was run perfectly. The reality is, too, if I thought everything was running perfectly, I wouldn't have been a researcher, because that indicates that there's enough information out there about how to design programs, how to allocate efficiently, how to be programmatically efficient is the term used in the executive order from this administration. If I thought that was already happening, I wouldn't be a researcher. I'd be using that evidence and just going and running programs and doing things. So could not agree more about that sentiment, and that's really important. But so it's really about how to do the reform and what to reform, and that's where the disconnect and the tragedy is right now. What can we do? So, two basic thoughts. One is that yes, there's a labor market challenge that's going to happen right now, no doubt, because you do have a lot of tremendous number of talented unemployed people, tremendous human capital, skills, and passion for serving both America and other people. And And so, yes, it's going to be a harder job market in that sense in the short run that I suspect will play its way out at some point. But it does make the need that much more. The fact that we have this happening, the fact that we are seeing tremendous change in whatever direction that is, does mean that that's a moment in which we need that much more evidence and more talent to be there at the guiding those kinds of changes happening in the world. Because as things get reset, if they get reset in a bad way, then that's really unfortunate and bad, basically, even worse than it has to be. And so we need more talent and more emphasis and frankly, more evidence. And some of the things that we see coming out about how they're going to use evidence are, I mean, including like the brief that we saw yesterday, has some really misguided ideas and understanding about what metrics can do for you. And that's unfortunate. So we do need really good people to work in the space and work harder. And
Dean, as you think about, sorry.
No, I was going to say one other thing. There's a politics policy issue here too. We can come to that later, but that's the other area is, there's some element where you can be the savviest, wonkiest person, in terms of the inner workings of aid and how to make it work best. But if you lose the politics, then it doesn't really matter. If you can't work under the hood in the engine, so to speak. And so it is a two-pronged approach. We do need to also work on the politics and the messaging of foreign aid, how to make that better understood. And that's a messaging. I don't think there's no panacea on that, but that is clearly important. A lot of the messaging that was used to take down USAID was just patently false. So there's some element where it's hard to plan ahead for completely false, false attacks that just come out of the thin air and are just patently incorrect in terms of what they're saying. And so when truth is no barrier to the rhetoric, it is hard to put forward a political response in a sense and figure out how to create the right buffer so it doesn't happen again. But that is something we need to work on. So we need people and talent on that too.
So Dean, as you see this, is this primarily just a financing shortfall, or is there more to it than this? Should we just try to find alternative sources of funding and that would help us resolve all of this crisis? Or is there a need to rethink development itself?
I don't know that I would. I don't. I think a lot of the things that even that they're suggesting are, there's no new idea in what they're suggesting. There were and there's always a lot of people thinking about ways to reform the system. So I don't think we need that, and I mean that for both the bilaterals, for philanthropists, for local government, et cetera. There's lots of effort there that I think I don't see this as something that means that we need to like rethink development in that way. But the part that we do need to rethink is the politics and the constitutional law issues that we're now facing and how we deal with that as a country. And that's going to manifest itself in other areas too. It's not just USAID. USAID was the kind of the first to go of agencies being dismantled. CFPB was right afterwards. Now we're seeing Department of Education. So the basic question about the power of the purse and the separation of powers and balance of powers, these are deep constitutional issues which we are now facing as a nation. And that's something that we did not, at least 10 years ago, definitely did not foresee that level of constitutional crisis.
A lot of our panelists, our attendees today, and we've had multiple sessions where we see that before, are people who are directly practitioners in development. Some of them have actually lost their jobs. And I'm wondering, as you think through now wearing the hat of a mentor or a guide, someone who teaches development, someone who's mentored, years of people, several of them who are in the call, actually, I can see them. What's your advice? What do they do?
Double down. there's, I mean, so there's two, I mean, and I say this both as implementers as well as researchers. So, you know, I'm assuming we have kind of both in the audience referring to both. Or you, I don't know if was your question focused on one group or is it
Yes, no,
collective?
both,
Both.
absolutely.
But yeah, double down. The problem is now worse, not better. So in a very simple way, we are, I think, you know, everybody listening here, I'm going to go on a limb and assume is motivated because of empathy, because of compassion for human suffering and wanting to do something about it and having some talent. Maybe that talent is maybe it's being math geeks like Asim and me, maybe, and realizing the math can actually help in these ways. Maybe it's a people, you know, people skills and managing people, being a leader. Whatever the case is, you know, the central driving motivation for everybody's career choice and life choice and was one of compassion and wanting to do something about human suffering with the skills and the talents that we have as individuals. Well, the human suffering is now worse. So like I think of it in a very simple, like comparative static kind of way, like why, like the problem's worse, that we should work harder, not less hard. Because the impact of our work can then just be that much more and the problem is that much deeper. So I would say double down, and which is a really hard message to, and I get how that's a, you know, it's an easy message to say, and I do have tremendous empathy for the fact that I get it, that that's not so easy to translate to when there aren't when there aren't that many jobs right now because of what's happening. So it's not that's not,
Dean,
it's not a
before
trivial
we
piece
move
of
to
news.
the bigger Q&A, I want to open up. We have lots of questions from our audience as well. Just I want to follow up a bit on that and kind of put the responsibility back on us. You know, you and I have been blessed enough to have led organizations. We currently are leading organizations. We're in the field of development. Is there a way we can generate further demand for all this talent? You're exactly right, right? There's a lot of talent which is out there. My fear personally is, as much as we're asking the talent to double down, people have to pay paychecks. You need paychecks to kind of survive their bills. And my fear is all this talent will, I mean, this is talented people, so eventually they'll find a job. The question is, will it be in development or will it be in something which kind of you just have to, make a realistic call over here? Can we come together and foster demand? Can we come together in ways? What's your idea over here? And when I say we, I mean the collective we in terms of sort of the different hats we're all wearing here.
Um, I mean, our constraint on researchers and hiring in that sense. I mean, there's now tremendous demand for more and more research and more evidence. It is a it is part of the calling in theory for what's happening. The demand for more programmatic efficiency is effectively a demand for more evidence on what works and what doesn't. There's a disconnect, of course, in what, you know, that those words are being used in ways that tell me that, you know, the word efficiency, I'm reminded of the Princess Bride whenever I hear that word spoken in from in some of the administration currently, of the line, I don't think that word means what you think it means, because they use the term efficiency to say things like we must track outcomes and we must use blockchain to track the money. And you know, tracking an outcome without a counterfactual is in most situations a deeply inefficient and could lead to very bad decisions where you are effectively going to Vegas with your adjudication of whether something works or not. There's many things out there that we know the link from an output to an outcome. We know that the medicine does solve the issue. We know that cash gets used in certain ways, and we don't need to just, you know, keep tracking outcomes when we recognize that outcomes get moved by many other things in the world, not just our aid program. I've seen proposals for metrics that are on making America prosperous that are literally about border crossings in America, number of unemployment in America, as if an aid program in Nicaragua should be evaluated based on metrics in the United States. It's the equivalent of me going on a diet and rather than tracking my weight, instead I decided to weigh everybody that lives in Illinois and add it all up and track that number and let that be an adjudicator of whether my diet was successful or not. Right? There's a dosage problem in some of the things being proposed and discussed, and it just demonstrates a huge gap from the word efficiency to an understanding of what that word really means and how to actually deliver programs that are based on good metrics that are well analyzed. So that's a a challenge that we're facing. But I'll stop there. I feel like I've not fully answered your question, but we can keep going.
Actually, the follow-on from one of the audience members. I'm just going to open up to the audience members. It's a great set of questions over here, which kind of continue on the same vein about what can we do and where sort of. I keep looking for silver linings over here, and so let me now. I'm just going to filter some of the questions to you, and we'll do a 2-minute responses to each dean, and kind of I just want to make sure we get through most of the questions. So the first one is really related to what we just said about sort of generating demand. The question is about sharing evidence with philanthropists or philanthropies, right, agencies. And so the idea is, can we, or is there an effort to share findings on the impact of aid or the effectiveness of what we're doing, which can be shared now with various philanthropies, organizations, or individuals, given that there's a decreased funding in development, is this a strategy we should be pushing for? And in that strategy, hopefully raise more resources into development that can then kind of take advantage of this release supply.
Yes, I don't know that I would say this changes it in the sense that this has already been exactly what the kind of evidence movement has been working to do. And we're seeing, seeing a cutback both in aid as well as evidence generation. And so both are now, increasingly important. And I don't want to pass judgment on whether those kind of the marginal importance of the two have changed in terms of their relative importance. We've always needed a world in which we do both. I mean, frankly, you can't really do research if you're not also doing aid, so it's kind of doing actual programs. So you always need, you definitely, if you're going to do evidence gathering, you have to also do things. So I don't really have a good way of thinking about whether those two slopes have changed to be able to say something other than both are now more needed than they were 2 months ago. The returns from spending more money on development, whether on implementation or on evidence gathering, both of those have gone up in terms of the return on investment that philanthropists can get. The second thing I'll say is the mapping of the evidence to policy and to practitioner to implementation is something that this was actually the big part of the focus of what we were building within USAID, and part of it was motivated by this recognition that USAID 20 or so years ago created an evaluation policy, which was basically a little bit ahead of its time in a sense, because there weren't that many. It was more about producing evidence, but it had a lens towards doing that with the idea that it then helps guide award making. But the fact is, there hadn't been that many studies at that point in time 20 years ago. That was kind of the beginning of this evidence revolution within development. Now there's 4,000 to 5,000 randomized controlled trials. The last time I saw a count, and what we were doing at USAID was trying to help map those studies to understand which ones of those are relevant for the decisions and choices that USAID is making, but then specifically, how do we make that translation for the procurement process unique to USAID? And that, you cannot just take some academic papers that maybe is great papers, maybe it's, that really test a theory very nicely, really nails it, has good empirical work, et cetera, et cetera. But you can't just hand that paper to a procurement person and say, here, write a solicitation. This tells us what to do. It doesn't, right? There has to be a translation that takes place. And that's basically what we were working on. And that translation is often donor specific based on their processes and how they were able to do things.
Just on that, there's a follow-up question that another individual has, which is, kind of hindsight review of USAID. Like, should we have communicated things differently to a US audience?
I would put that in the bucket of we can always improve and learn from things that don't go well. But a lot of the things that came at USAID were just factually, were just either lies, mistruths, or tiny tiny, tiny things that were not, an accurate capturing of USAID. There were awards that were, on in sectors and cause areas that the incoming administration does not like, right? Things that supported LGBTQ rights and protected from stigma, mental health, violence in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, things of this nature. Small, but small awards at the end of the day.
Makes sense.
And so, that's not fraud, waste. That's just a difference in preferences. That's, and we can argue about, the being more than just a preference and actually being about value and ethics. But at the end of the day, the inability to recognize that a difference of opinion on whether something is a good thing to do or not is not really the we shouldn't be using words of fraud and waste. That's just that's just mischaracterizing, but it's a powerful word. It influences public opinion. It gets repeated. But how do you, I wouldn't say I would fault people for like, hey, you didn't take into account people blatantly lying about what you're doing and create a buffer for that. That's really tough to expect of any industry, any sector, any cause.
Makes sense. I'm just looking at my list of questions. There's now at least 10 or so left. And so let's try and do a speed response version, Dean. So 30 seconds each. I'll give you a short version of the question and I'd love a quick response to it. There's a question on, is a general loss of resources or drop in resources going to lead to more government scaling of successful programs? So in some sense, suddenly people double down and say, we'll just do more of the stuff we know works. Or is it likely that we're just going to do actually the opposite, just less of that because there's less money? What's your sense?
Well, the reduction in the workforce does lend itself to not being as complicated about what we were doing, which actually I think is a good move. I think a lot of what USAID was doing in some cases did try to pack too many different disparate activities all into one thing. Using the evidence to understand that like this scalpel-like program does work, can be done at scale, will lead to more programmatic efficiency, and is easier to deliver on fewer people. So I think, yes.
There's a follow-up question on this, which is the research to kind of policy pipeline. And they're kind of asking, in your experience, what are the big obstacles to kind of scale? So as we think about evidence that already exists and doubling down on that evidence, you already mentioned there's one constraint, which is just people won't be there. Other constraints or other things that could be moving positively on that direction?
So I think there is a constraint on the academics. We don't do enough meta-analysis. For what it's worth, my research is shifting because of that recognition, and seeing that firsthand from the flip side has really motivated me on a personal level to do more meta-analysis and to do more translation work. So that is one obstacle. That is by no means the only obstacle, though, because there is a lot of good meta work that does just get ignored. I think there's also, it's really easy to fall prey to poor analysis and kind of soft thinking about trade-offs, and recognizing that just because there's 12 things that may work all compared to not doing anything, that doesn't mean they all work compared to each other. In fact, they can't all work compared to each other. The math just doesn't work that way. But that's a very analytically driven point. It's one of the reasons why I often refer to myself as the chief trade-off officer within USAID, because I felt like that was my role, not to make the choices, but just to point out the trade-offs and make those salient. But that requires a change in internal processes that comes from top down. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is the two words programmatic efficiency at the top, but we're not seeing any evidence in what we are seeing suggests that is the way those words are being interpreted are using a very distorted and unsatisfactory definition of those terms.
Diversity of funding. Question about, have we relied too much on government funding? Is there a role for private companies, DFIs, development finance institutions to fill in?
So let me break that into two parts and try to pack that into 30 seconds. There's two different pieces there. There's the government versus private, and then there's the grant versus loan and equity investment. Those are two very different things. I do think there is a role for government, very clearly. There was a collective action problem. This is Econ 101. There's a reason why the government does things. We don't ask the same thing of the military, and for good reason, and same thing for foreign aid. It serves the greater purpose of the country, and we would have a collective action problem if we just relied on private philanthropy. So we also have, there's an aggregation of information that is also a fixed cost of that information that can be acquired and done by the government more easily. So those are, that's my answer on the government versus private philanthropy. The question about loans versus grants that's a longer conversation, and I think it at the end of the day should be guided by clear-headed thinking about what do we actually get from one versus the other. If something can be scaled by for-profit companies, of course we want to see that happen, as long as it doesn't create negative externalities. But that doesn't mean that all investment is good. If we just cared about private, counting jobs, which is unfortunately the metric that you see coming out of groups like DFC, that would mean that we should just go break windows and fix them, and we create a lot of jobs. Obviously, that's not right, and that's not what they're actually doing. But the point is, you cannot use jobs of your companies you invest in as your sole metric of success. That is missing the point of what we mean by investment leading to growth and then rising up all boats.
There's a series of questions about from pedagogy and students, basically, people choosing to build a career. And so let me sort of group them into two things. One is just general advice on people who are already in the field. If you have any quick thoughts on, we talked about doubling down already. Is there something more specific you want to say to them, which could be helpful? And the second, I think, is also, do we begin to teach differently in light of what's happening? Do we change? There's been discussion, at least at the Kennedy School. Our dean sort of recently at an event, and I've sort of recently echoed the same sentiment, to think of ourselves more as policy or development entrepreneurs, not policy or development employees.
I mean, my overall sentiment is not a very helpful one, but it's just to say thank you to people who are working on this and who are able to stay at it. And I realize that might not be able to stay at it if there's no job, and then it's easier said than done. But the needs are that much worse now. So to those who are able to stay at it, thank you.
Makes sense. And just to kind of echo what Dean just said, thanks, absolutely, I think, but don't lose faith. I think there's a tendency that we're in this moment and it feels really dark, but we don't know how this is going to shape up in the coming months or years. I think one thing Dean said right in the beginning, which I wanted to double down, is there's a lot of uncertainty of what's going to happen. And in some sense, before people make big decisions on life changes, see if you can have some cushion to play out that uncertainty, right? I think things will resolve. At least I'm somewhat optimistic on that. And I think Dean's caution in the beginning to say, look, don't make strong predictions right now, right? That's what I heard you saying, Dean, that it's a lot of things that we don't know how they will shape up. So it'll be good to at least think a bit about that. Question on building political support for development. I know you mentioned that at the beginning, you said you come back to it, but so I want to come back to it now to say, how do we build political support?
Frankly, I think there's been other topics that I think important research has really helped move the needle on the conversation. Gay marriage is a good example of one where there was a lot of stellar work to understand how to message and move the needle on attitudes and opinions on gay marriage, which kind of laid the groundwork for the societal changes there. Maybe that's what we need to. Maybe we need more research that is kind of persuasive political psychology research that helps understand those shifts and then helps us inform how to better message. We do have the problem of, like I mentioned earlier, that it's hard to plan strategically when what comes at you and is not correlated with truth or negatively correlated with truth. So it's hard to anticipate what exactly is going to come at you. How do you respond? Things like that. But that's an area that I'm hoping that really good people work more on, and we maybe see some progress on that. You also can just work under the hood. I think foreign aid will survive as a concept. It's going to, go up and down in terms of its dollars. It'll change focus, but working under the hood, accepting the politics for the politics, and saying how do we do the best we can with what we got at all times. That's a noble effort, and is needed, and is less at risk to the ebbs and flows on because it's always
There,
whether times are flush or not. We need to be efficient with what we're doing.
Makes sense. There's still a few more questions, but I think I'm just going to ask the last question and kind of end with that, which is a big think question. And this question is really sort of challenging us to say, look, the world is very different in 2025 than it was in the 1960s, right? At that point, poverty rates were 60, 70%. Now they're kind of 10%. And so, the other actors who've entered, China has risen. So is the world less about poverty alleviation now and something else? And if so, should we be sort of focusing on what is that something else that we should be focusing on? Is it that poverty doesn't quite sell as well because it isn't as big anymore? And in that new reimagining of the kind of, if you will, the ideology or ethos of why we're engaging in the world, what is the role of the US?
So I have two basic thoughts. One is it's true that poverty has gone down in terms of absolute levels. And so maybe that says we spend more time on other forms of human suffering, civil unrest, violence, civil liberties, war and things of this nature. And so just in terms of the relative, I don't know what the trend data looks like on war. Maybe I should know that better. But I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that even if it has gotten better, it has not gotten better as much as poverty has gone down. So maybe there's a reshaping there in terms of emphasis of focus, but both fit under foreign aid, to be clear, in terms of the types of things we do. The second observation is that poverty is relative, not absolute. Our definition of what it means to be poor is very different today than it was 100 years ago, and it'll be very different in 100 years. So what we think of as tragic is in an absolute level in 50 years is going to be different. And there's still going to be vast inequality and vast compassion for the people who are left behind, who do not have access to the markets, who are not able to achieve as much economically because of the environment in which they're finding themselves. And that's going to happen even if everybody's wealthier, right? There's still we're going to just shift our definition, so to speak, of absolute poverty, but we're still going to be, I think, motivated by recognizing injustices and inequalities. And that's not that relative poverty doesn't change, in a sense. It's one way of thinking about it.
Makes sense. We will, unfortunately, this has been phenomenal. Dean, you're always superbly generous with your time. I thank the audience members for their time. Just a few last words. One is several of the documents that Dean mentioned, the articles, memos, and stuff, we'll share afterwards with audience members. So they can have a look at what Dean was referring to. There are additional events. I'll be talking to the World Bank President, Ajay Banga, next week. And then we have sort of USAID in the Future Foreign Aid, the kind of the sixth in the series, if you will, with Fatma Sumar, CID's Executive Director, talking to a set of sort of INGO experts as well. And so with that, I wanted this session to come to a conclusion. Dean, thank you for all that you're doing in development. Thank you for having the courage to both join and to now speak your mind as you have. A lot of the audience members have mentioned personally kind of how much they've been affected by you and the work you've done. And so I have seen that personally as well. So I'm very grateful again to all that you're doing and will continue to do. And with that, I wanted to thank everyone for attending today. Thank you. Hope to see
Thank you
you
very
over the
much.
next